What's up, my wizards? It's Dev, Mtg. We like it in Magic, you know by now, all that good stuff. It is the first video of War of the Spark deck season, and what did the patrons pick? We went with the Grixis Zombies. And you know, really, it's no surprise that we're going to open the season up with a Grixis thing of some kind. It's kind of the talk of the town right now. Nick All Bolus, mid-range, for lack of a better name, is kind of running wild all over Arena. You probably experienced that. But today, I'm actually going to bring you two very different Grixis lists than what you've been seeing so far this season. I would imagine, at least. We're going to do a sort of fast zombie aggro deck that actually exists right now in the format. I think it's better than it's been in a long time. But we'll also do a very different deck, just Grixis Amass, which is much more of a mid-range or tap-out control deck. So two very different decks today. But I wanted to go ahead and take the opportunity to double dip and do a double deck tech for our first deck. There's probably going to be a lot more double deck techs this season. Just a quick heads up, because there's a lot I want to do in War of the Spark, and Grixis Zombies is no different. So let's go ahead and get things started with the aggro deck. Now with the aggro deck, I'll kind of work my way from the top down because the most important cards in the deck and all the good zombie payoffs sit at the very top of the curve. And the best of those, Liliana Untouched by Death. This card is much, much better now than it has been in a while thanks to the Amass mechanic. And I know that 6-mana Lily is getting all the press. She's like the #1 card in a lot of people's lists for War of the Spark. But don't let that make you forget how good 4-mana Liliana can be. Now we got a bunch of cards in this deck up under Lily on the curve that allow us to functionally put a bunch of bodies onto the battlefield at one time, again thanks to the Amass mechanic. It's just like kind of the best piece of removal we could ever hope to play against any aggro or even mid-range deck, again depending on what point in the game we're at. In the mid and late game, this will easily kill 4 and 5 toughness creatures, no questions asked. Now the +1 ability has always been the worst ability on the card, and it's no different. You will +1 this occasionally, and for what it's worth, we're playing 28 zombies in the deck, so it's pretty likely that we'll rip one with that +1 and actually be able to do a little bit of damage, gain a little bit of life, help win the race against aggro decks, and just do a little bit of incremental or reachy sort of damage against control decks. Those are both good things, but most of the business, especially against control decks and mid-range decks in this format like Sultai, is that -3, that ultimate, we'll call it. You know, she can ultimate the turn she comes into play, but usually you'll save it till the next turn when you have open mana. And again, this works really well with the Amass mechanic. Even though you can't ever bring in more than one token at a time with the Amass mechanic, it's still nice to just ultimate Liliana, bring back a Lazotep Reaver and a Gleaming Overseer. That's a 5-mana play that got you 3 bodies on the battlefield, 4 total power, and 2 of that power has Hexproof and Menace. Not a bad deal at all, and again, instantly refills your board really easily against the control matchup. But obviously Lily requires a ton of zombies and a really low curve to actually work the way you want her to. So to that end, pretty much almost the entire rest of the deck is going to be zombie dudes, including the other most important sort of zombie payoff on the deck, Death Bear. And I should probably go ahead and show you this, even though it's self-evident why we're playing this. In this deck, our curve is low enough that this is kind of equivalent to a Banalish Marshal to us. A little bit easier for our opponent to pick it off with like a shock or a moment of craving or something. And yes, that does still suck, but Death Touch is great. We don't really, considering we have to play Liliana and a bunch of zombies, we don't have a whole lot of options for other removal spells, and giving our zombies Death Touch goes a long way towards sort of filling that gap. Plus, of course, the Anthem effect is nice. It's kind of the entire reason we're playing the Baron. But let's get low here and talk about the 1-drop creatures that we're playing, because we got 8 of them. We got to get on board really fast, and we want to play a creature on every turn leading up to Liliana if we can help it. So we got to play a bunch of 1s. We're going to start with the brand new Grim Initiate, old G.I. Joe here, and I think that's actually an appropriate name, because this is the grunt of all grunts, the gruntiest creature that we can possibly play in this deck. There's a 1/1 for 1 on Maul's Goblin Raiders, but it's also kind of a hunted witness. This also works kind of well with Liliana and obviously Death Baron, because not only will Grim Initiate be a 2/2 Death Touch, but the token it leaves behind will be as well, even if it's the only army token on the battlefield. It'll at least be a 2/2 Death Touch, so that's pretty sweet. And with Liliana, this is obviously a way to, you know, be able to block or attack in recklessly with one of your early zombies and still have a zombie on the battlefield when you do drop your Liliana to make sure her -2 is as good as possible. Now, down here in the 1-drop slot, we're also playing 4 copies of Diregraph Ghoul, which might surprise you. You might assume that you just play Gutter Bones in this slot because Death Baron gives the bonus to skeletons, yada yada, but we're playing Liliana, and it's kind of the most important card in our decks. We want to max out Lily's potential as much as possible. That kind of requires that we play nothing but zombies, because all 3 of her abilities want us to be playing zombies. Plus, This has an extra point of toughness, so sometimes it won't die in situations Gutter Bones would have died, so there's that too. I guess what I'm getting at is that this graph shows better results. It's probably my favorite pun in the whole video. Moving up to the 2-drop slot, because we're playing 4 copies of Dreadhorde Butcher. Your friendly neighborhood butcher man. He'll sell you chops and steaks and cuts and such. I could probably keep going with the butcher analogy, but I'll stop now, because the card is actually just really good, and I want to talk about that. Just the start of, like, Diregraph Ghoul into Dreadhorde Butcher can get out of control, like, really fast. You know, even if your opponent has the Kaya's Wrath or something, they're still going to take a bunch of damage before they drop Wrath, and even when they do, they'll take a bunch of damage from Butcher dying. So it's just a really crazy card if you actually get it on turn 2, especially if you're on the play. It gets really out of hand. It just gets way bigger than you paid for it in terms of rate, and your opponent has to worry about one of their own things dying when they kill Butcher. So you can just run it into stuff, and it kind of has Death Touch. But obviously, Death Baron can just actually give it Death Touch. And this trick is confirmed to work, by the way. If your Dreadhorde Butcher dies while you have a Death Baron on the battlefield, it really doesn't matter what power it's at. It can kill any creature on the battlefield. This is actually a lot better than it looks against small aggro decks. It doesn't look great, but if it dies, it's going to take out Sky Marcher Aspirant, Dauntless Bodyguard, Siren Storm Tamer, Terramander before it adapts, you know, Mistcloaked Herald. There's just a ton of different things that this can kill right now. It's a Viashino Pyromancer, Tithe Taker, or the token it leaves behind, Hunted Witness, or the token it leaves behind. There's just 1,000 creatures in Standard right now that a Dreadhorde Butcher can kill, even if it's just never gotten a counter. But once it starts getting counters, it goes crazy. Now, we're also playing 4 copies of Lazotep Reaver because we need some more 2-drops. This won't be the last one that you see, but this is kind of a zombie goblin instigator, which it's actually even better in a lot of ways because it puts 3 total toughness on the battlefield, where instigator only puts 2. Creatures still have an obviously relevant creature type. You know, this puts 2 zombies on the battlefield on turn 2 for an eventual Liliana payoff, which is very nice. Or just turn 3 Death Baron after a turn 2 Reaver is a very nice play. Now, we've got 4 more 2-drops in the deck, but we're going to implement a 2-2 split between the last couple of 2s that I want to play here. The first thing that we're going to do here in the 2-drop slot is Graveyard Marshal. Just a couple of copies of this. It competes just a little bit with Liliana. There's some tension there because obviously we want to be able to play zombies out of our graveyard. Graveyard Marshal is going to take those zombies out of our graveyard. But that's totally fine. We kind of don't care. You know? And this works with at least one card in the deck that gives our zombie tokens different abilities. So keep that in mind. I've already mentioned Gleaming Overseer. That's the card I'm talking about. We'll get to it soon enough. So, you know, not only will Gleaming Overseer give you your Amass tokens, the Hexproof and the Menace, but it'll also give your Graveyard Marshal tokens, Hexproof and Menace, which is a nice little bit of cross-play there, too. I like a lot about Graveyard Marshal. In an aggressive zombie deck like this, we have to play some number of it, but I want to leave room for Soul Diviner. This at a 2 of as well. Even though this isn't quite as aggressively statted as some of the other 2-drop zombies that we're playing, it's still really, really nice to have, you know, especially in the mid and late game. It can take counters off of our Amass guys and start drawing cards. Super valuable to have, but really, if you look closely, it's able to take counters off of a lot of different stuff in this deck. You know, it's able to take counters off of Liliana sometimes when you want to, if you absolutely have to draw cards. That's a thing to do. And it can even take tokens or counters off of, say, Dreadhorde Butcher. If you've got some extra ones of those, or you just have a dead hand, nothing in your hand, you absolutely have to draw cards and get gas. Soul Diviner can do that if you're willing to trade some offense off of Dreadhorde Butcher. So there's actually a bunch of different targets for Soul Diviner in the deck. And again, even though it's not like super aggressively statted, it has at least an acceptable stat line, and if it even draws you 1 or 2 cards in a game, it's probably done its job for you, especially at just a 2-mana rate. But the last of the Walking Dead in the deck is Gleaming Overseer, and it'd be a glaring oversight if you overlooked this overpowered card. Keep doing it. I got all day, but anyway, Gleaming Overseer is obviously powerful in this deck, and it works pretty well against both sort of the, you know, aggro decks and the control decks. I like cards like this, even though, again, not the most aggressive stats in the world. You're really only getting 2 power for your 3 mana, which is not the best rate, I'll admit, but still. Against, say, mono red or mono white, the 1/4 blocks on the ground all day. 4 toughness is actually really, really high against all of the ground creatures in the format right now, outside of like go big decks like Gruul and such. But in most, you know, mono white, mono red aggro, stuff like that, this is going to block on the ground all day. And Against control, it creates a token, so it helps you go wide on the battlefield, force a sweeper out of your opponent, so it plays well in both matchups, and that's important for a card to do. Also, it's kind of awkward that they're on curve together, but this does end up working really well with Death Baron, because when your Amass guys have both Menace and Death Touch, it takes 2 things to block them, but those 2 things are both going to die, so that's a nice little combo of abilities to have there. But the last, non-land card in the deck is actually also not a zombie or a Liliana Planeswalker, it's Heartfire. And I've waffled back and forth here, and I'm still not sure whether I want to play this ultimately or Lightning Strike. Lightning Strike doesn't require you to have anything on the battlefield if you just want to cast it, which is a very valuable thing, but the extra point of damage is also incredibly valuable on this card, and it works really, really well with cards like Dreadhorde Butcher. Obviously, you do 7 or 8 damage all at one time with a Heartfire and a Dreadhorde Butcher, but it works well with a Grim Initiate too. So if you're looking to sacrifice stuff, we've got plenty of good cards to sacrifice in the deck. And if you want to look at it this way, literally every non-land card in the deck besides Heartfire can sack to Heartfire, including Liliana, which can be a nice play. You know, if they swing in on Liliana and you're going to lose her anyway, just sacrifice her to Heartfire, kill something they're attacking her with, or just hit them in the face for 4. You know, Heartfire can be a straight-up finisher some of the time. That extra damage is really going to help you close the gap and close the game. You know, we're playing a bunch of creatures in this deck with slightly less than desirable stat lines, even though this is ostensibly an aggro deck, you know? But that said, we've got things like Gleaming Overseer and Death Baron that are only 2 power total for 3 mana, and even things like, you know, Soul Diviner, for instance. It's a 2 mana 2/3, that used to be a kind of impressive stat line, but it just isn't anymore in a world full of really high power aggro creatures. You know, so we need something to, again, help count up that damage as quickly as possible. Heartfire's really, really good at that. Now we're running 24 lands in this deck, and it looks like 17 black sources, then it takes a steep drop to 10 red sources and 9 blue sources. But it's actually a lot better than that once you see the unclaimed territory. You know, this helps us play Grim Initiate on turn 1, or any blue zombies that might be in the deck. This is going to obviously help us play, but it even helps us play like Graveyard Marshal on turn 2 when we need to. So there's a lot that unclaimed territory does for us in the deck. Now here's our sideboard here. Even though this deck looks pretty best of 1, to me at least, every deck deserves a sideboard, so we're going to do 3 copies of Duress to hold off the control matchup, and that's really what we're doing with a lot of our sideboard slots. Lazotep Plating gives our creatures hexproof for the turn, keeping them off of creature removal, and giving us a creature, or just making an Amass dude bigger. All of that's good. We also play Negate as another way of keeping them off removal, but we counter Planeswalkers and enchantments like Search for Azcanta and stuff, Wilderness Reclamation. Negate can go a long way in this format, obviously, but we've got Dreadhorde Invasion too. This goes in against control as well, where our life total is a resource we don't mind using, like at all, and if they don't draw Mortify, they're just dead to this thing, so, especially if we get it in the early game. So Invasion is a great tool against Esper and Grixis control, and as far as Lava Coil goes, this will usually just come in against the creature-based matchups. As far as Midnight Reaper, this could be in the main deck, and I've kind of gone back and forth on a different number of Gleaming Overseers and Midnight Reapers in the main deck. You could consider doing that as well, because this is a lot of card advantage. A ton of card advantage, but it's really nice against control decks, obviously, where you're basically punishing them for removing your zombies. And it's a zombie itself, too, so it probably should be in the 75, if nothing else. And we've also got 2 copies of Liliana's Triumph in there. We can actually take advantage of the Liliana clause on this a good deal of the time. In matchups where we have to kill Carnage Tyrant, obviously Liliana's Triumph will come in. When we do get the extra value off of it, this is just an insane removal spell that'll often clear the way and actually let us get in for the win. Now we got some power rankings for your first deck right here. A final score of 66, not an aggressively high score or anything, but still holds its own and does pretty well in the arena meta right now. It outlasts a lot of other aggro decks, and aggro decks are mostly what you're going to be playing on the lower ladders. This isn't quite as aggressive as those decks, but it's got resilient tools like Liliana, and even things like Gleaming Overseer, to just block better than a lot of other cards in other aggro decks. But let me just say, even with the resilience factor, the deck is, like I said before, kind of a step off in the speed department, especially compared to the other aggro decks in this format. I mean, just the baseline of mono red, mono white aggro decks are fast enough, but there are aggro decks that people are putting together in this format right now that feasibly kill on turn 3. This deck does not do that. So we are just not as fast as an aggro deck necessarily needs to be to really call itself a fast deck in this format. So you are missing that, and honestly, I wish the deck did a little bit more. That's why you see the relatively low versatility score, is because this deck is, I guess fittingly, mindless. You know, it kind of plays like a zombie. You just, you know, play up your curve and you get Liliana. And that's kind of all you want to do in this deck. There are a whole bunch of different sequences that lead to a bunch of play lines against different, you know, matchups in the format. It really just plays very linear, but you're kind of okay with that. It's an aggro deck. But by and large, this deck is way more resilient and plays way more out of its graveyard than a lot of other aggro decks in this format, and that is where the trade-off is. If you value that kind of resiliency in this format, then this deck is one of the places that you probably want to park your aggro hopes. But honestly, in terms of consistency and speed, this deck does take a couple of points off compared to some of the monocolored decks in the format. Now on to the second deck of the day, and like I said, this one is completely and totally different in terms of philosophy. There aren't a whole lot or any real zombie payoffs in the deck, but every creature that we make is in fact a zombie. So I guess it's kind of a zombie deck, but this is more based around the Amass mechanic and some of the really kind of broken-ish stuff that you can do with it in this format, and a couple of really important cards to go along with it. Now, the first and most important card to highlight in this deck, I think, is probably God Eternal Kefnet. You know, it doesn't have a mass or anything, but it is a zombie. So we can still kind of call this a zombie deck. I think that this is far and away the best of the gods. And I like my Enter the Battlefield value, so I like Ronus, love me some Bond too. But in terms of the, you know, advantage a card can get you over a long game, this is easily the best. And note how this is worded. You can do this on your opponent's turn too. So if you're able to play an instant speed card draw spell, and you get an instant or sorcery off that card draw, then you're able to get a discount on it, copy it right then and there. Now, in order to get a hit off of Kefnet while drawing cards, you want to play anywhere between like 20 and 24 instants or sorceries in your deck, but we've actually gone way above that number. We're playing 27 instants and sorceries in this deck, so not quite half the time that we draw our first card of the turn, we'll get a hit off Kefnet. Now, we'll show you those spells in just a second, but actually, before we get to them, I want to go ahead and knock out a couple of enchantments that we're playing in the main deck before we get to the rest of the spell base, which is entirely comprised of instants and sorceries. But before we get there, we're going to play a couple of copies of Search for Azcanta because we're playing 27 instants and sorceries in the deck. You know, just an insane engine. We will fill our graveyard relatively quickly. This will always be flipped by the late game, at which point it's just the easiest way to get card advantage in all of Standard. You know, I don't care that it doesn't necessarily work, quote-unquote, with Kefnet. It's still an insane card advantage tool, and it's always going to find something that we need for the moment. So at least a couple of copies of Search. It's just as good as it's always been. But speaking of 2-mana enchantments, we're going to spread the love between colors here and play 4 whole main deck copies of Dreadhorde Invasion. I'm not sure that 4 is the correct number. You could probably get away with 2 or 3 in the deck, honestly, but I just love the way this plays against controls. You know, we're ostensibly a control deck because we have a ton of, you know, answers in this deck for aggro decks. You know, we've got so much removal that's actually effectively dead against control decks, so I'd really like a main deck piece that's actually good against control, and Dreadhorde Invasion fits the bill. And sometimes that last little bit of text on the card is actually kind of really, really important. You know, especially in the aggro matchup, if you're able to make a big enough Amass zombie, then you can start swinging in with lifelink, and suddenly you've really turned the tables in the aggro matchup. And really, getting a 6/6 army token is easier than you might think with Enter the God Eternals in the deck. This amasses 4, so if you have a Dreadhorde Invasion out, pretty easy to have a lifelink dude after you cast this. Plus, it gains you 4 life when you cast it. So this is just another ridiculous card in the aggro matchup. It doesn't matter really what aggro deck you're playing against. Once you resolve this card, you have a huge dude on the battlefield, and you gain a bunch of life back. It doesn't even really matter what else the card does. But, oh, by the way, it also kills pretty much any important aggro creature in the format. By Waverly. It's like, all my cats just left me. Now, we're also playing 4 copies of Widespread Brutality. This is basically our main deck sweeper in this list, and it actually works pretty well. We got a bunch of stuff up under it on the curve, again, like Dreadhorde Invasion and a few other cards that allow us to get an Amass token onto the battlefield relatively quickly. So if we can get, you know, a 1 or 2 power Amass dude onto the battlefield before we cast Widespread Brutality, it's effectively just a 4-mana sweeper against every deck in the format, especially the smaller aggro decks. Even just the basic Pyroclasm mode on this is going to kill a lot of stuff in mono white and mono blue, so sometimes you won't even really have to have support for this to sweep your opponent's board and put something on the battlefield for you. And unlike a lot of sweepers, it's not dead against control. That's one of the things I like about Widespread Brutality. You can just cast this and get a 4-mana 2/2. It's not good. I'm not saying it's good, but it's also not dead, which you can't say about, like, Kaya's Wrath, for instance. Now, I should also point out, by the way, with both this Widespread Brutality and the last card, Enter the God Eternals, if you do happen to have a Kefnet out and you rip these sorceries at some point during your opponent's turn, let's say you play an Opt, and the card you reveal is a Widespread Brutality, well, you get technically a 1-mana discount on that. You can play it for 3 mana at effectively instant speed. So when your opponent attacks into your board, if you have a Kefnet out, play your Opt, and see if you can pull an Enter the God Eternals, because that's crazy if your opponent's about to attack in on you. But so is Widespread Brutality in that situation. Just keep in mind, there are ways to play these at instant speed in this deck. But why don't we just play cards that are already instant speed, like Commence the Endgame? This was #1 on my sleepers list, not knowing that it was #1 on everyone's sleepers list, apparently. The first week results on MTGO came, and it turns out that, like, 3 people that got 5-0 last week were playing this card as at least a 2-of in their deck. It is extremely powerful. Been compared to Torrential Gearhulk, flashing back like a divination effect, and I could definitely, that's a perfect comparison, but some of the time, it's bigger than a Torrential Gearhulk. Like, this can easily be a 6/6, you know, a point of power bigger than a Gearhulk at that point, and draw you a couple of cards, which, by the way, again, works well with Kefnet in a couple of ways. You know, if you've got all of the mana in the world, you can just play Commence the Endgame, which is going to draw you cards on your opponent's turn. That way, if you do have any extra mana laying around and you actually rip the first draw from Commence the Endgame as an instant or a sorcery, then you can play that. That's cool. You can copy it and play it. So that's nice. But also, if you're able to, say, play again an Opt or something on your opponent's turn and you get a Commence the Endgame and you have a Kefnet out, then, of course, you can always just play Commence the Endgame for 4 mana. That's an insane discount. So there's just a lot of cool things this does with Kefnet in a couple of different ways, but you really don't need Kefnet. It's just another win condition for the deck that makes a huge creature at instant speed, usually during the opponent's combat step. So it's a finisher, card draw piece, and removal piece all in one. Now, the rest of the deck is card draw and removal of various stripes. You know, we're playing 4 Opt. I've already brought this card up a couple of times, but it's just the cheapest way to get, like, real value off of Kefnet on your opponent's turn, and it's just a good card on its own. You know, just 1 mana to scry and draw is always going to be at least decent in your control deck. It helps you churn through to get the pieces that you need as quickly as possible. But we're also playing Chemister's Insight too. Just a couple of copies of this. This works well with Kefnet on your opponent's turn too, in a couple of ways. Obviously, if you play an Opt and you rip Chemister's Insight, well, you can play Chemister's Insight for just 2 mana at that point and draw an extra 2 cards. But this can also sit in your graveyard until you can have enough mana at the end of your opponent's turn to draw, 2 cards off of Insight, and also maybe one of those, or maybe the first draw that you get off of Insight will be, a spell that you can copy and discount with your Kefnet. So there's a lot of action, a lot of enabling of Kefnet going on here, but obviously Opt and Chemister's Insight are both good cards of their own accord. But as far as disruption and removal and stuff, we'll start off with 4 copies of Thought Erasure, another good early gameplay for us. Obviously great disruption against, control, another good option against them, but this can be great against aggro and mid-range decks too, to just get the most, dangerous thing out of their hand, the most devastating option they have. That can be great in the early game. But another little piece with Thought Erasure is that it can help set up Kefnet draws by giving you that surveil, so keep that in mind too. Apart from that, though, other removal pieces include 3 copies of Lightning Strike, which looks a little bit weird, but we've got a bunch of cards that are good against aggro. We got a bunch of cards that are good against control, but we can easily draw like the wrong half of our deck in either one of those matchups. So I wanted a card that's kind of good against both. Like this deals damage straight to the face and kills planeswalkers sometimes against control. It's obviously just a really serviceable removal piece too against most of the mainline aggro decks in the format. So I wanted a card that pulled a little bit of double duty. I didn't want another dead card in the main deck, against control, like Lava Coil, Cast Down, even Tyrant Scorn I considered, but above all else, I just didn't want a card that was dead in any matchup. So I played Lightning Strike here. But I also played 2 copies of Callous Dismissal in the 2-drop removal category. In a way, this is just a little bit of, stretch. We want to be able to get out Amass tokens before we actually play Widespread Brutality to make sure that we maximize the effectiveness of Brutality on turn 4. So this is a way to get a turn 2 Amass token and get a little tempo. We can take a creature off of our opponent's board, and that's going to help just sort of, slow the game down, present a speed bump to help us get to Widespread Brutality in the first place. So that's an important part of the card, to help us get to, Enter the God Eternals, take the game over with that card. So we want to get to those points in the game. Callous Dismissal is a way to get a creature off the board and get a creature on our side of the board. It's just kind of card advantage in that way. Excellent tempo, and it's good that it's also not quite dead against control either. It doesn't say creatures, it's non-land permanents, so you can get Search for Azcanta off the battlefield, other Dreadhorde invasions if that's ever a problem, but also walkers like Teferi and Kaya and 3-mana Teferi. There's a lot of walkers in this format right now, so this actually gives you a pretty wide spread of options. And even though I'm still looking at playing a card like, say, Blink of an Eye over this, considering we're trying to amass for Widespread Brutality, I think this gets the nod. Plus, there's going to be times with Kefnet on the battlefield where you can just effectively play this at instant speed, so that's nice too. Now, we're also playing a couple of copies of Vraska's Contempt as just catch-all removal, Anything bigger than 4 toughness that Enter the God Eternals can't kill, or anything we can't kill with, say, a Widespread Brutality, even if we make a zombie that's relatively big, Vraska's Contempt can just take out for us and gain us a little bit of life, which is important considering we have Dreadhorde Invasion in the main deck. I like that little bit of extra life gain. I'm going to finish the main deck off here, besides the lands, obviously, with just the 1 copy of Bleeding Edge that I'm playing in the main deck. Now, on Arena, I think this card is way better than it's going to be in Paper, especially if Paper trends more towards control as the season goes on, which it very likely will, I think. But once that does happen, I don't know that Bleeding Edge is going to be playable whatsoever. But in the Arena meta right now, where we're seeing a lot of smallish and even middling creature decks, this is actually a great card that takes out even stuff all the way up to 3 on the curve a lot of the time, and gives you an Amass token. This is great before, say, a Widespread Brutality on turn 3 to take out an Adanto Vanguard, which it always kills, by the way. I want to point that out. That's very important. This kills Adanto Vanguard in the same way that like Moment of Craving does. But this also helps fill the 3-drop slot, unlike a card like Moment of Craving. Really don't have enough action at 3 in this deck, if you didn't notice, so this helps fill that hole a little bit, and is going to take out Sky Marcher Aspirant, Adanto Vanguard, again, Dauntless Bodyguard, pretty much any Tithe Taker, the token it leaves behind. It's going to take out pretty much anything in mono blue, even if it has a Curious Obsession on it, other than, say, Tempest Djinn or Merfolk Trickster, but like every other creature in that deck, this is going to kill. A lot of the stuff in mono red, Vyashina Pyromancer, Get to Lava Runner, this is going to kill. So this kills like a huge number of creatures in this format, right? A lot of War Elves, Incubation Druid before it gets counter. I mean, you can just keep going. This kills so much right now and puts a permanent on the battlefield. It's a less expensive Ravenous Chupacabra that ends up having a good creature type. So there's that too. So I like a lot about Bleeding Edge, and even though I obviously don't have the faith to make this a 2 or 3 of, I will take the 1 of, because there are times even in the late game where you draw this against aggro and it's a very, very good card. And here are your lands right here, 25 of them in this deck. It's a little bit hungrier, plays 6 drops and such, so let's feed it at least 1 more land. And we've actually got a pretty good spread of colors here. It feels like cheating in a way to just play all the duels, but that does give us 17 black sources thanks to the 1 swamp that we're playing. I think we need to prioritize black a little bit more, especially for game 2, where we're going to have Cry of the Carnarium and Duress coming in from the board in a lot of matchups. So prioritizing black, we got 17 sources of that, but it still leaves us with 16 blue and 16 red, so we got plenty of sources of all the colors. Now, this deck really splits its sideboard between control and aggro, but those are the 2 things I'm most worried about, especially here at the beginning of the season. We've got Duress in there against control, as usual, plus Negate and Disdainful Stroke, which I actually think is a very powerful card against control decks nowadays, and decks like Reclamation, for instance. Keep that in mind, too. But there's also Thief of Sanity, a 4 of Thief of Sanity, even though it's not on zombie theme. I actually don't care too much about the zombie theme in this deck whatsoever, because there's not really zombie payoffs. So Thief of Sanity is going to come in against decks that side out their removal against us, which won't be every deck, but a lot of control decks will. That's where Thief of Sanity can come in and really do damage, and again help fill out that sort of thin 3-drop slot. That's important. But we've also got Liliana in there. If we can resolve this against control, it's a fine card. But this is really good in grindier matchups like Sultai, for instance. And there's a bunch of mid-range decks going around in the early going of the format. Again, Grixis, Gruul, there's other decks too. And this is very good in those matchups where you're sometimes going to get in a war of attrition, or you just need to beat a couple of big drops, like say Carnage Tyrant. This has good value against that too. So at least the one copy of Liliana. This is, again, the most hyped card in the new set, but I think it's really only good in this deck in very certain situations. And if you're going to play a 6-mana card, I think Commence is the better main deck card for this deck specifically. But here are some power rankings for this deck right here. Final score of 66, which is weird. I actually didn't do that on purpose. And honestly, after messing around with both decks, I feel like this is by and large the more powerful of the two decks. And the price tag shows too. Sorry about that, but this deck is a little closer to like $300, getting into the pricey end. But if you wanted a different variant on, say, Esper Control that's not so like dry and by the book and overplayed at this point, you know, if you're a control player, you played a lot of Esper, it's an interesting path to go down. You know, it taps out a lot more. Playing sorcery speed stuff like Callous Dismissal, Dreadhorde Invasion, Search for Azcanta, which you were going to play anyway. But Kefnet, you know, that's effectively a sorcery speed card. Plus, you know, the God Eternals, Widespread Brutality. We're tapping out a lot on our turn in this deck, and that's why one of the reasons I'm not playing counterspells. But counterspells also don't work very well with Kefnet for what that's worth. So ended up cutting the counters, but nothing stopping you from putting them in. If you want Sinister Sabotage or even Ionize, you could slap those into this deck. It actually goes pretty well as far as what you're looking for in a Grixis control deck in this format. You might want to slot in Nikki B, Nicol Bolas, for all I know, but honestly, it's a pretty serviceable Grixis Amass deck that's actually able to use things like Callous Dismissal and Bleeding Edge and Dreadhorde Invasion to start amassing relatively early in the game, and 2-for-1ing the opponent too with some of those spells, and then using Widespread Brutality to crack the game wide open. If there's still another creature that they play on their next turn, you know, if they try to refill their board with something, boom, enter the God Eternals, or just Kefnet comes down and outclasses their guy. Commence the end game comes down, outclasses their guy, get you 2 more cards. There's just a lot this deck can do in the mid and late game once it actually does get its important removal pieces, you know, played, and it can actually start like really kicking things into high gear and taking the game over. And I like a lot of what this deck does. Now, I tried to do something for everybody in this first video of the season. You know, if you're an aggro player, gave you a little zombie aggro deck to look after, but if you're a control player, gave you a little Grixis Amass deck to look at. I'm going to try to do that a little bit more often this season, but I guess that we're done for the first tech of the season, so just turn it over to you. Let's, you know, make sure you do all the YouTube stuff. It would really help me out. A lot of work went into this one and every video that we do on the channel. I think this is going to be pretty much the best deck tech season that we've ever done. There's just so many crazy things to do in War of the Spark Standard. Just so much that I cannot wait to get to. So make sure you subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. Hit the bell for the notifications, because at this point we'll be doing deck techs 3 times a week like clockwork. There's going to be 2 more this week, so sub to make sure you get all the content. Like this video if you enjoyed it, and if you have any questions or concerns or things you would have rather played in this deck or either deck, just let me know down there in the sideboard in the comments section. And of course, if you wanted to play either one of these 2 decks, the best way to get your hands on them is just to click the first link in the description, and also the second link in the description, and go to TCG Player. I'll list both of these decks on that website for you as links in the description. That way, if you want to pick up any pieces from these literally brand new decks you probably don't have a whole lot of pieces from yet, you can just click those links and get them from the cheapest website on the internet for buying singles. It is what it is. TCG Player has the lowest prices, so if you're interested in any of these decks, make sure you click the links, because you're not going to get them cheaper than that. And remember, this deck, as well as most decks we do here on the channel, was brought to you by the fine folks over at Patreon that support my channel. You guys all voted on what deck you wanted to see first, and we're going to keep doing that all season. It's only $1 to put into the Patreon and actually vote on what decks you want to see. So if you got $1 lying around, just click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/SBMTG. You can do that too if you really wanted to. Just throw $1 in the pot and you can vote on what deck we do next. There's a poll live right this second for the next one. So get in there if you feel like it. Vote on what decks you want to see. And I guess I'll catch you cats later. That was a good first deck tech, everybody. I'm really back in the swing of things, I've been waiting on Deck Tech season for like 3 weeks now. I've been ready, sitting on go. I've got a lot to show you this season, so do all the YouTube stuff, and I guess I'll catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love, and be kind.